Let's look at the next type of epithelial tissue. As the name suggests, it is a false stratified columnar epithelium. So pseudo-stratified means false stratification. So it appears to have several layers of cells because if you look at the nuclei, they are at different levels. So these darker round circles that you see in tissue samples are usually the nuclei of the cells. Since they sit at different levels, it appears as if there's many layers of cells here. But indeed there is not. It's a single layer, but some cells do not extend to the apical surface, so it appears as if there's many layers. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium can be ciliated or non-ciliated. An example of where you would find ciliated pseudostratified columnar is in the respiratory tract. Now we mentioned previously that there's ciliated simple columnar in some of the smaller airways. Well, the trachea is a prime example of where you would find this pseudostratified columnar. So in the little drawing here, we show the trachea or windpipe. And on the inside lining of that trachea, you would find this type of epithelial tissue. The next tissue is stratified. So it is indeed many layers of cells. It's a stratified squamous epithelium, which suggests the cells are flat. And it got this name because of the cells that are closer to the apical surface are flat. Sometimes you look deep down at the deeper layers and the cells don't look very flat, but they flatten up as they get pushed towards the surface. So it has many layers of cells of which they appear flat towards the surface. There's two types of stratified squamous epithelium. There's keratinized and non-keratinized. Keratin is a protein found in many cells of the epidermis. So keratin is a tough, fibrous protein that helps protect the skin from heat, microbes, and chemicals. So when you see the word keratin, you typically think skin, hair, nails. What makes fingernails so tough and strong is the keratin that is found in those structures. Non-keratinized stratified squamous does not contain keratin, but it is indeed many layers of cells that offer quite a bit of protection. A good example of where you would find non-keratinized stratified is on the inside lining of your mouth, the inside lining of the esophagus, part of the epiglottis, which is kind of a little flap that closes off your airways when you swallow, and part of your throat or pharynx, and lining the vagina. So this tissue is not as tough as keratinized, but it does offer quite a bit of protection to these surfaces. For example, if you were to scratch the inside of your mouth, you can remove a lot of the outer layers of the stratified squamous without damaging the underlying tissue. So the function of this is typically protection. That's the reason why there's many layers of cells, to really protect that organ from abrasion, protect it from, for example, in the skin, we protect from UV light and protect from foreign invasion. So if a microbe tries to penetrate, it's very difficult for a microbe to penetrate through many layers of cells. Okay, finally, the last epithelial tissue on our list of epithelial tissue to know about. It's known as transitional epithelium. Transitional means variable. So it appears a little different based on how much that organ, that tissue, has stretched. So a good example of where to find this would be in the urinary bladder. So the inside lining of the urinary bladder has to be able to stretch. So when your bladder is full, that inner lining has to be able to stretch and accommodate that stretch. So when this epithelial tissue is in its stretched state, it looks much flatter. Whereas when it's in a non-stretched or kind of a relaxed state, the epithelium looks thicker. This one's very difficult to identify because it looks like a stratified squamous. You won't have to identify this one because of its variability, but you should be able to identify the function of transitional epithelium being able to stretch, and the location is in the urinary system. So for example, the lining of the bladder, the ureters, which transport urine to the bladder, and the urethra, which transports urine out of the bladder. A couple last things when it comes to epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is known to form glands. A gland is simply some organ or tissue that produces either a hormone or some sort of secretion. And that means there are two different kinds of glands. There are endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands secrete hormones into the bloodstream. There's a whole system called the endocrine system. And these organs produce many chemical messengers known as hormones to regulate a lot of other organs in the body. For example, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, adrenal glands, and other organs like ovaries and testes are part of the endocrine system. So if you produce a hormone, you're an endocrine gland. That endocrine gland is largely made up of epithelial tissue. Exocrine glands are a little different. They do not produce hormones. So I would write down, do not produce hormones. Instead, they produce some sort of secretion or product. It could be sweat. It could be saliva. It could be oil that goes and coats your skin. It could be digestive enzymes. So it's some other material or product that has to be delivered to some sort of a surface or some sort of a cavity. So for example, sweat glands, oil glands, earwax glands all need to deliver that material to the surface. So the gland itself is typically found deeper in the organ. So for example, a sweat gland is found in the dermis, which is underneath the epidermis. That gland is made up of epithelial tissue, and then it has a little sweat duct that transports the sweat up to the surface of the skin. Digestive glands, such as salivary glands, have to make that saliva, and then it needs to be transported by way of ducts to your mouth. The pancreas produces a lot of our digestive enzymes. They need to be transported to the small intestine. So, first thing to know is that exocrine glands produce some sort of secretion that goes to some surface or cavity. And in order to get there, there has to be a duct, a little tube to deliver that secretion. Endocrine glands do not have ducts. That hormone goes right into the bloodstream. Continuing with exocrine glands, there are three modes or mechanisms by which exocrine glands work. There are merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. And the difference is how they produce their secretion. So let's look at merocrine first. An example is salivary glands. Saliva is produced inside of the cell using the ER and Golgi, and it is exocytosed into the duct that will then deliver that saliva to the mouth. Okay, so exocytosis, delivery using a duct. Apocrine secretions, such as mammary glands that produce milk, the secretion is made from pieces of cells. So the difference is it's not exocytosis, but instead fairly large chunks of the cells of the gland pinch off and become a portion of the secretion. And then finally, holocrine secretions, the entire cell matures, dies, and then becomes the secretory product. And an example of a holocrine secretion is sebaceous glands that produce oil. So we got 3 different ways to make exocrine material or products. Either exocytosis, pinching off and becoming part of the secretion, or having the entire cell, the whole cell, become the product. Okay, that's a lot of information on epithelial tissue. The next category is going to be connective tissues. But before we get to connective tissues, there's a little aside, and that has to do with membranes. Different membranes are found throughout the body. There are mucous membranes. They line body cavities that open to the outside. The GI tract has a mucous membrane. The reproductive tracts have mucous membranes. The respiratory tract has a mucous membrane. And the urinary tract has a mucous membrane. All of those organs are open to the outside. The next type of membrane are serous membranes. These are double-layered membranes. There are 3 of these in the body. There is the pleural membrane, which surrounds the lungs. There's the pericardium, which surrounds the heart. And there's the peritoneum that surrounds organs in the abdomen. Both of these are made up of epithelial tissue. There's also the cutaneous membrane, which is your skin. And then there are synovial membranes. Synovial membranes are found in certain joints called synovial joints. The big difference between synovial membranes and the other 3 is synovial membranes are not epithelial tissue. They are actually connective tissue membranes. The next video, we will begin our discussion on connective tissue.